Hi everybody, my name is Ariel Gold. I'm the Palestine campaigner for Code Pink and a member of the Ithaca Committee for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace Ithaca. Before I introduce Miko, one more quick announcement. We have Medea Benjamin from Code Pink, renowned activist, coming to Ithaca on November 19th at 12 o'clock noon at Buffalo Street Books. Also, she'll be speaking about her new book, which talks about the relationship between the U.S. and the repressive regime of Saudi Arabia. Also, Miko Peled's book is available for sale at the back table. It's $20 and he can sign it after he speaks. We would like here in Ithaca to express our solidarity with the water protectors at Standing Rock. So Miko Peled grew up in a prominent Zionist family in Israel. His grandfather signed the Israeli Declaration of Independence, and his father fought in the 1967 war, which began the still ongoing occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. Miko himself joined the Israeli Special Forces, and in 1997, his niece was killed in a suicide bombing. This propelled him and his sister to evaluate. I myself met Miko for the first time when my children and I were in the West Bank, in the village of Belin, where he goes often to stand shoulder by shoulder with his Palestinian brothers and sisters. So, rather than listening to me go on, it is my great, great pleasure to give you Miko Peled.
Thank you. Thank you, Ariel, and thank you all for coming and setting all this up so beautifully, the food and everything. This is an incredible gathering, and it's a pleasure to be here in Ithaca, where so many activists do so much important work. So thank you for everything that you do, and thank you for being here tonight. So if you have a phone, maybe you can just silence the phone, but if you want to use it to tweet or post things while I'm talking, I would encourage it. So just so we have that clear. I think every American today has to have the number 38 billion engraved in their minds and in their hearts. 38 billion. The number 38 billion, I think, is an important number for everybody who lives in the U.S. today to remember. Because that is $38 billion is the amount of money that the United States just promised Israel over the next 10 years. $38 billion. It's a foreign aid package to a country that doesn't need foreign aid. It's a fully developed, wealthy country, wealthy state that doesn't need, doesn't require, and certainly doesn't deserve foreign aid. And this comes in the heels of many, many decades where billions and billions and billions of dollars have already been given to Israel. So the reason this is important is because nobody in the United States can claim that they're not involved in the issue of Palestine. Nobody can say they're not involved. I would say unless we stand up, unless Americans actually stand up in opposition to this foreign aid, unless they stand up clearly in opposition to Israel, then we are complicit. Unless we stand up clearly that we are complicit, and we're complicit with horrendous crimes. I believe that the crimes committed by Israel are tantamount to genocide. If we look at the United Nations definition of genocide, and we compare it to what Israel has been doing over the last 7 decades since it was established, the two lists will fit almost perfectly. Almost perfectly. So being complicit with genocide is a very serious thing, and this is our tax dollars going there. These are our members of Congress voting. This is our president who is signing off on this. And so all of us, unless we stand up clearly in opposition, are complicit in terrible crimes. Nobody in the United States can claim that they're not involved. And I think this is something very, very important that we should all take, and all Americans should take very seriously. Now, if anybody thinks this is a good idea, that's fine, that's their set of values. If we disagree, if we think this is a bad idea, then we absolutely have to act, and we have to say it in the strongest possible way. And that's kind of what I'm going to be doing tonight. Like you heard earlier in the introduction, my journey was a little bit of a strange one because I was brought up in a very patriotic Israeli family, as the title of my book suggests. My father was a general in the Israeli army. And then, sadly, in a way which I think is typical, I was awakened as a result. I was awakened or driven to take a look at the issue of Palestine closely as a result of a tragedy. And I think it often happens to us as human beings. We're driven to take a look at the world around us, and we're driven to explore the truth as a result of tragedy. So in my case, it was the killing of my niece, my sister's little girl, in 1997 in a suicide attack in Jerusalem. And so I began this very strange journey as an Israeli into Palestine. And that's, of course, the subtitle of the book, The Journey of an Israeli into Palestine. And when you think about it, it's a very short journey because it's a very small country. But the journey from this very privileged sphere of the Israeli Jew, which is well paved and clean and organized and safe, into this very, very different sphere of the Palestinians is a huge task. Not geographically or physically, but emotionally, mentally, and certainly politically. It's a huge task. And that's a journey that I embarked on, and I've been on for almost 2 decades now. And that's really the story. I don't know if you saw, but a few weeks ago, somebody posted an interview with the late Palestinian writer Ghassan Kanafani from 1970. Ghassan Kanafani was a prolific writer, and he was the head of the PFLP, which is one of the Palestinian resistance groups, kind of very socialist oriented. Anyway, he was killed by Israel in 1972, and this interview took place in 1970. And it's a short clip, maybe 3-4 minutes long. And I really recommend that everybody look and listen to his words. And in this interview, the reporter, who's an Australian, he's in Beirut, he's at Ghassan Kanafani's office, and he asks him about the civil war. This was during the attack on Palestinians in Jordan. And Ghassan Kanafani corrects him, and he said, no, this is not a civil war. And so then he goes on and he says, well, whatever you want to call it. He goes, no, it's not whatever you want to call it. This is a struggle of a nation that has been oppressed and has been dispossessed and has been kicked out of their land. It's a struggle for liberation. And he makes it very, very clear that how we define what is going on in Palestine, how we define what happened to Palestinians matters. It's crucial. And it's interesting because some people call it a conflict, some people call it an occupation, some people call it a dispute. And unless we define it clearly to ourselves and unless we express very, very clearly what it is, then number one, people are not going to know. And number two, we're never going to be able to reach a solution, because if we don't know what the problem is, there's no way that we can act and move forward clearly towards a solution. And the interview, he talks about many other things, and it's like, although it's short, it's very good, and I strongly recommend it. I posted it on Facebook, and many other people did. And if you haven't read Ghassan Kanafani's books, they've all been translated. Short stories have been translated into English. I strongly recommend it. And one question that I like to begin with tonight also has to do with defining the issue. When people talk about Palestine and Israel, there's often the impression that there are two countries, or it's not clear whether it's one country or two. So I pose this question to everybody here to think about: are Palestine and Israel one country or two? Because when people visit, they always come back and they say, well, I've been to Palestine, or they'll say, I've been to Israel, or they'll say, I've been to Israel and Palestine. Or they say, this thing happened in Israel and this thing happened in Palestine. So is it one country or two? I think this is an important question. And when we define the reality, what is happening in Palestine, we have to have that first question answered. My understanding, from having been born and raised and lived there many years and traveling back there a lot and spending a lot of time there, is that Palestine and Israel is the name for the same country. Two names for the same country. There is no country that is separate. There is no Palestine separate from Israel, and there is no Israel that's separate from Palestine. It is one country that currently has two names, and two nations live in that country, Israelis and Palestinians, and that is the reality. Now, people often describe the reality in Palestine today as war. We hear that all the time, particularly when Israel is attacking, like they did in 2014. People call the war in Gaza, and they define it as a war. And when you think of a war, or at least when I think of a war, I think of two armies engaged in battle. But that has never happened in Palestine. There's never been a Palestinian army. So who is this other army? When you travel and when you're in Palestine, you see there's only one army present, and that's the Israeli army. By the way, can I see a show of hands? How many people have been there? Every people here been to Palestine or Israel? Okay, thanks. Is anybody here from there? Palestine, Israel, Palestinians or Israelis? Nobody? So there is one army, and it's everywhere. It's the Israeli army. And there's also really one state. There's really only one government. That's the Israeli government that controls the lives of everybody who lives there. So it's really not two countries, two states, and two armies. It's one country, one state, and one army, but two nations. And one nation is oppressed by the other. Which is why, perhaps a better definition of the reality in Palestine is that it is a struggle for freedom and for justice by the oppressed. And I think if we are able to define that and to make that clear, then we can move forward beyond that. Now, we know that peace talks have been taking place for 2 decades now or more. And they've led to nothing. And people often will say, oh, the peace talks are failing, the peace talks are failing. Why are the peace talks failing? Well, peace talks are failing because peace talks are not the solution to the problem. When you have two armies, two nations at war, then you bring the two sides, you stop the fighting, and you bring them in for peace talks. When you have oppression and you have a struggle for freedom, then peace talks are irrelevant. In this interview with Hassan Kanafani that I spoke about, one of the questions that the reporter poses to him is why don't you sit and have peace talks with Israel? And he looks at him and he says, "What? You mean capitulation? You mean surrender?" He says, "What kind of talks will these be?" He says, "It'll be like the sword negotiating with the neck." What are you talking about? And of course, peace talks are the wrong thing. And of course, we've seen the peace talks have failed because they are not going in the right direction, because they are not the solution to a struggle for freedom and justice. The right thing would be resistance, which is why I and so many others here are wearing these BDS pins. And we'll talk about the resistance and about BDS later. But when we have a struggle for justice and liberation, then resistance is the answer, not peace talks. And this is why the peace talks haven't worked, because they are not the solution to this particular issue. Now, another issue that is somehow problematic for people to define is the issue of the occupation. When did the occupation begin? Where are the occupied? People say the occupied Palestinian territories, and they usually refer to two small parts of Palestine called the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Well, what about the rest of Palestine? The West Bank and the Gaza Strip were taken by Israel in 1967. The majority of Palestine was taken by Israel in 1948, and it was occupied from 48 to 67. So how is it that when we talk about these two little areas of Palestine, which make up only about 22% of the country, as occupied Palestinian territories? And the question that I ask are there any Palestinian territories that are not occupied somewhere? All of Palestine is occupied. The occupied Palestinian territories are all of Palestine. The West Bank and the Gaza Strip were taken a little bit later than the rest of Palestine for reasons that have to do with Israeli politics. It has nothing to do with the Palestinians. But again, we have to make that clear so we know what we're talking about. Then people talk about illegal settlements and the expansion of settlements. Israel has been engaged in building illegal settlements in Palestine since Israel was established in 1948. There's not a single city or town or village or farm in Israel that is not built on stolen Palestinian land. They are all illegal settlements. So the expansion in East Jerusalem or the expansion in the West Bank is meaningless because the expansion goes on everywhere. It's not meaningless, but it's no different than the expansion that goes in other parts of Palestine. So it's very important to understand that the whole country is Palestine. Every Israeli city and town is an illegal settlement. And as Israelis, we are all settlers and colonizers. This is crucial if we are going to move forward and try to understand how to resolve this. Now, just to kind of, summarize it, in 1948, when the State of Israel was established, as a result of a campaign of ethnic cleansing and terrorism to which the Palestinians were subjected, Israel was established on 78% of Palestine. It occupied 78% of Palestine, which is all of Palestine except for the West Bank and Gaza, which, by the way, were determined by Israel. There are no natural boundaries that define the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. They were defined by Israel for reasons and for the needs that suited Israel at the time. 20 years later, in 1967, Israel decided to complete the job, and that is precisely the way they defined it. That is precisely the way the Israeli generals, among whom my father was a member, the Israeli High Command, to complete the job. And completing the job was completing the occupation, completing the conquest of the land of Israel. And having completed it, having completed the conquest of the land of Israel, they finalized the establishment of a single state over all of Palestine with exclusive rights for Jewish people, which is what we know as the State of Israel. And again, this time they were able to completely, at least in their minds, cross Palestine off the map completely. And that is what we have today. So this notion, which still exists and people still talk about, that somehow the occupation of Palestine began 50 years ago or 49 years ago is absurd. The occupation of Palestine began almost 70 years ago, almost 7 decades. And the other notion, which comes as a result of that somehow one day there will be an Israeli government that will allow the Palestinians to establish some sort of state within the boundaries of Israel, or Palestine, depending how you call it, is absurd. Israel will never allow it. As long as there's a state of Israel, there will never be Palestinian independence. As long as there's a state of Israel, there will never be rights. No, Palestinian rights will always be infringed upon. That is the reality that we have to come to terms with. And I think, once again, if we talk about a solution, if we talk about how we resolve the issue of Palestine, we have to have that clearly in our minds. Now let's talk a little bit about the Gaza Strip. I think the Gaza Strip is an incredibly important thing to talk about. Like I said earlier, there is no natural boundary to the Gaza Strip. Excuse me. Somebody came one day and drew a line and said this is going to be the Gaza Strip. And why did they do that? In 1948, when the ethnic cleansing campaign was going on, there was a need to find a place to house all the hundreds of thousands of refugees from the southern part of the country. So refugee camps were created along the city of Gaza, along the coast. Palestinians were herded into these refugee camps. A line was drawn, and that was the Gaza Strip. And ever since then, the Gaza Strip has been the home to hundreds of thousands of poor, homeless refugees. Only a couple of weeks ago, the population in Gaza reached 2 million. With the birth of a baby that was born a couple of weeks ago, the population in Gaza has reached 2 million. Okay, now you can look at the stats. I won't go over all of them, but some of them are very interesting. First of all, it's a very small place. It's one of the most densely populated places in the world. Like I said, over 2 million, because this was 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, it was 2 million. Many babies were born since. The average age, of course, is 16, which means the majority of the people who live in Gaza are children. The vast majority of people who live in Gaza are actually children. According to the United Nations, people in Gaza suffer what they define as it's not hunger, but it's food insecurity. It's one step before hunger. 90% of the water in the Gaza Strip is not fit for drinking, for human consumption. And on and on and on. What's interesting is the very bottom of the list of that list is 92% literacy rate. 92% literacy, that's higher than the United States. And normally when you have high literacy rate, you have high employment and low poverty. Why is it upside down in Gaza? It's upside down in Gaza because of a reality that's imposed on the people of Gaza. And again, we have to understand that all of this is a result of the ethnic cleansing that took place in 1948. Unless we understand what took place in 1948 in Palestine, we will never understand why there's so many poor refugees in Gaza. We have to connect the dots. And another interesting aspect of this is that while people remember that Israel has attacked Gaza, what they call wars, in 2008 and then 2012 and on and on and on, so many times. The last major attack was 2014. Israel began attacking the Gaza Strip as soon as the Gaza Strip was established. This is nothing new. And what makes it even more horrible is that this humanitarian disaster that exists there, that's been existing there for decades, is 5 minutes away by car from Israeli cities and towns where you wouldn't dream of not having clean water in the tap. You wouldn't dream of not having electricity. You wouldn't dream of not having good roads and medicine if you need it or anything else. A child in Gaza with a curable disease, curable cancer, will die because they are Palestinians in Gaza, while a child in Israel 5 minutes away with the exact same disease will live. That is a reality. And again, as Americans give $38 billion to the state of Israel, we need to remember those children. I'm not even talking about the children that are killed by bombing and shooting and so forth. I'm talking about just the reality, the day-to-day reality, the lack of access to the basic most healthcare, to the basic most things like clean water and electricity. And I couldn't. As an Israeli, I'm not allowed to enter Palestinian territories at all because Israeli law prohibits it. So while the West Bank is porous and you can go in and out as you please, the Gaza Strip is completely sealed. So I can't go through Israel. I tried to go through Egypt because Gaza has a part of its boundaries with Egypt. But the Egyptians are collaborating with the Israelis and have been for a very long time on this issue. So I couldn't get in, and the border is closed most of the time, so I couldn't get in this way. And then something very interesting happened. Excuse me. I got a message from a friend in Gaza asking me if I would consider entering through the subway. And it took me a minute to try to understand what they're talking about, and then I finally figured it out, and I said, yes, of course, I'd be willing to enter through the subway. And of course, what they were talking about was the tunnels. Now, there used to be hundreds and hundreds of tunnels. Even though the border with Egypt is very small, maybe 7 or 8 miles long, they had hundreds and hundreds of tunnels dug because that was the only lifeline, the only way to bring in food and water and medicine and cash and, I mean, anything you could possibly imagine and have people go back and forth was through the tunnels. So I said yes, and the picture you see are the tunnels that I had gone through. Now, what's interesting is this. The drive from Jerusalem, which is where I live, to Gaza is maybe an hour and 20 minutes. I had to drive from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, then I had to fly all the way south to the Egyptian border, across the Egyptian border, then drive through the Sinai Desert, all the way up to Rafah, which is the border town. Part of it is in the Sinai in Egypt, and part of it is in Palestine. And then wait for several hours until the permission was given to go in through this tunnel. It took me exactly 14 hours. Thank you. It took me 14 hours, and I remember the moment I came out through the other end. It's about a 4 or 5 minute walk. I looked at my watch, and I was 14 hours away from the time I left, and I was only an hour and 20 minutes away from my house in Jerusalem. It's an unbelievably absurd reality, an absurd situation. You know, of course, now the tunnels have been destroyed mostly by the Egyptians, so even that lifeline no longer exists. Even that lifeline is no longer there for people in Gaza. This is a picture I took. This is a gate going into a school. I think it speaks for itself. It says that you're not permitted to bring in weapons into the school. But of course, the weapons coming in through the gate are not the problem, because the violence comes from Israeli jets and tanks and mortar fire and so forth. And I have this picture. This is a picture of Israeli commandos coming out of Gaza in the early 1950s, having completed what they call punitive operations. Now, why is it that as early as the early 1950s, which is when the Gaza Strip was early established, were Israeli commandos going in to punish the people of Gaza? Have they not been punished enough? So Israel passed a law. As soon as the Gaza Strip was closed, Israel passed a law in the early 50s that said it was illegal for Palestinian refugees to return to their homes, to enter back into what became Israel. But still, they would come looking for food, trying to go back to their homes, to their fields. From time to time, they would go in and execute acts of armed resistance. So every time this would happen, Israeli commandos would go in and commit terrible massacres. This is actually a unit that was created especially for that in the 1950s and was headed by the infamous Ariel Sharon. He's in the picture, in the bigger picture, the kind of the heavier set guy is the young Ariel Sharon. Today, the attacks on Gaza look more like this. So the technology has improved. And whereas in the early days, they were able to kill maybe dozens or several hundreds in each attack, in 2014, for example, they were very proud of the fact that they killed over 500 people in the first 3 minutes of the attack. And they had 6,000 flyovers, dropping millions of tons of bombs on a civilian population that has nowhere to go, no shelter, and has never had a military. There has never been a tank in Gaza. There has never been certainly a fighter plane in Gaza. And the 6,000 flyovers came up before the ground troops came in. And Israel called up something like 40,000 reservists. And again, to go in and do what, precisely? Well, this is what it looked like at the end of the Israeli assaults. And these are just a couple of pictures random pictures that I took when I was in Gaza. Now, it's interesting, after these operations, after these horrible massacres that Israel commits, the United Nations and others come in to investigate whether human rights were violated, whether war crimes were committed. And I scratch my head and I think, you need a committee for this? You need an investigation? When you drop a 1-ton bomb on unarmed civilians, what exactly is the expectation? And when you keep doing it over and over and over again, 6,000 flyovers, millions of tons of bombs, is there really an expectation that civilians will not be hurt? And I think it's very easy to conclude that the reason these attacks take place is to murder as many civilians as possible. Because murdering Palestinian civilians, committing massacres has always been part of Israeli strategy. It's not a tactic, it's not a mistake. Only recently, about a week ago, was the 60th commemoration of the 60th anniversary of the massacre of Kfar Qasim, where the Israeli authorities, Kfar Qasim is a Palestinian village that was inside the state of Israel. But in those early days, even those Palestinian towns were under an Israeli military governorship. And there was a curfew at a certain time every day. Well, the military governor decided to make the curfew earlier. Instead of 8 p.m., 5 p.m. But they did this after all the villagers and the people from the town had already left for work, so they didn't know. So anybody that came home from work after 5 p.m. was shot. 49 people were massacred on that day. And then the government said, well, it was coming of a rogue army unit. The commander didn't understand the orders exactly, and so on and so forth. There are several articles that have just come out on this issue in Hebrew and in English. And it's very clear that that massacre was another attempt to try to get the Palestinians who live in an area that's called the Triangle in the northern part of what became Israel to leave. The massacre was part of a strategy. And it hasn't changed. Massacring Palestinian civilians as a strategy has always been part of Israeli strategy, because the attempt is to either kill them or get them to leave. But when we talk about Gaza, there's one thing that never seems to happen, and nobody ever asks the question, why? Why? There's never been a tank in Gaza. There's never been an F-16 in Gaza. There's never been a regular army in Gaza. Yet somehow, through some inexplicable magic trick, Israel manages to sell this idea that it is acting in self-defense. And if you listen to the news when these things take place, every commentator, every talking head, every politician, not only in America, but all over the West, in Europe as well, repeat this strange mantra that Israel is acting in self-defense. Self-defense exactly from what? The idea that the Gaza Strip poses a military threat to Israel is not ridiculous. It's science fiction. It's absurd. No one, not a single person who has any kind of information about what goes on in the Gaza Strip can seriously take this explanation, accept this explanation. A military threat to Israel with this massive army from Gaza, where the majority of the people are children, poor refugees, where there's no clean water, barely food. There's never been a tank, a military force in Gaza. What is this nonsense? How are people swallowing this nonsense? How is Israel able to commit to put together this magic trick where it convinces everybody around that there's a military threat and it's doing what it's doing as a means of self-defense? It's beyond absurd. It's beyond unbelievable. It's criminal. It's inexcusable that anybody would repeat this nonsense, that Israel is acting in self-defense. But still, we haven't answered the question, why then? Clearly there's no military threat. Why is Israel, for almost 7 decades, entering Gaza and murdering civilians by the thousands? The last attack in 2014, Israel murdered 2,500 people in broad daylight, on prime time, as we were all watching. And the 2,500 were the ones that were killed on the spot. We're not even talking about those who died, the thousands who died later on as a result of their injuries. Because besides the fact that Israel targets hospitals as well, there is no access. There's nothing there because the Gaza Strip is sealed. And Israel won't give them access to Israeli hospitals, even though they're 5 minutes away and are fully equipped. So 2,500 is the number of people who were killed during the attack. We're not even counting the ones and the tens of thousands that were injured, and 100,000 or so that were made homeless. But why? Why is Israel doing this on a regular basis? What is the problem? When we look at this humanitarian disaster that Israel created in the Gaza Strip, and we look at the reality, the quality of life of Israelis in Israel, which many times, like I said, is 5 minutes away. Israeli towns, some of the Israeli towns and farms and so forth are 5 minutes away from Gaza, maybe 10. And when we compare these two, that questions the legitimacy of the state of Israel. That is a threat to the legitimacy of the state of Israel. And for Israel, the legitimacy is like the Holy Grail. There is nothing more important than legitimacy. There is nothing more important than the narrative which says that we are the David in the David and Goliath story. We are fighting for our lives. We are defending ourselves and so forth. Anything that will threaten this legitimacy needs to die. Now, when we look at the Gaza Strip, there are only really two options. Doing nothing is not an option. So Israel has two options. First option is to take $38 billion, repatriate the refugees, rebuild the destruction that Israel created, and everybody goes home alive. But Israel doesn't want the Arabs back. We kicked them out, not to let them back in. So the only other option is to kill them and blame them for being terrorists. And lo and behold, it works. Israel kills people, massacres them, and then blames them for being terrorists, and the whole world claps. Everybody's bowing and saying, yes, they're terrorists. Israel has a right to do this. It's a perfect example of how for the last 70 years Israel has managed to maintain this criminal activity and always come up maintaining the moral high ground, or at least claiming to maintain the moral high ground. Ethnic cleansing? Yes, but we were there 2,000 years ago and we're back, so it's okay. Murdering people in Gaza? It's fine because Hamas is in Gaza and Hamas are, we know, they're terrorists and all that sort of thing, so it's okay to murder all these civilians. Somehow they always manage to twist the story. What is I think, inexplicable is how the rest of the world accepts this. And by the rest of the world, I mean the Western world. We know that in the Arab world and other places, they don't accept it. This is, again, something we need to think about. We need to remember as we think of the number 38 billion, because those $38 billion are going in order to facilitate these crimes, to facilitate these massacres, to facilitate this genocide against the people who have done nothing wrong. Now, let's look at other parts of Palestine. This is East Jerusalem. Just random pictures that I took. If you've been there, you know, massive, massive amounts of soldiers. The military presence is heavy, particularly if Jews have some kind of a celebration. So Yom Kippur, I was there, the entire city was sealed. Police and military everywhere. Palestinians are closed in. Young Palestinians being stopped and frisked all the time for no reason. Now, if it ends in stop and frisk, it's okay. If they don't get beaten and killed, it's good. It's a miracle if they manage to get home alive. Many times they get shot. This is the reality in East Jerusalem, probably one of the toughest places to be if you're a Palestinian. This young man, this young man is 13 years old. And moments before we took this picture, we saw him, we came to visit him, he was actually handcuffed to the bed. I have a picture where he's handcuffed to the bed and his wound is open so you can see it, but I thought I'd spare you that picture. So he's 13 years old and he was shot so severely in the leg that they had to amputate his leg from the knee down. Yet he was handcuffed so he wouldn't escape. He can't walk. He'll never be able to walk. And the reason that they give for this is this new term that Israel established, that Israel created. It's called a child terrorist. He was a child terrorist. Who is a sick maniac that put these two words together in a sentence? Child terrorist. And of course the claim is that he had a knife, or he was going to have a knife, or that he saw a knife. But it doesn't matter. He's shot and he's losing his leg and he's 13 years old. And it's forever. And he's lucky because he's alive. That's Jerusalem. If you've ever been to Hebron, I took these pictures while I was driving, so they're not that clear. If you drive south in the West Bank, the southern part of the West Bank towards Hebron, there's a big intersection called the Etzion intersection. And it's always been it's always very tense because it's an intersection where some of the most rabid, vicious, violent Israeli settlers live, and also home of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. It leads to Hebron and many of the other towns. So there's always heavy military presence. Now, I know we took this picture recently, they have at 8 or 10 different points along this intersection, snipers in posts with their eye on the sight and their finger on the trigger. All the time. Now, they're not going to shoot someone who looks like me or has an Israeli license plate when I drive by. But can you imagine being a Palestinian, having to go to work, having to go to school, having to travel, having to come and go? And you see at every point all around you snipers ready to shoot. This is the reality on the way to Hebron. Now there's this new thing. Well, it's not that new. It's been several years, but it's relatively new. And that is the criminalizing of charity to Palestinians. Criminalizing of charity to Palestinians. In other words, charity organizations they work in order to alleviate some of the suffering of Palestinians, families of prisoners, orphans, and so on, are criminalized, and the claim is that they are supporting terrorism. Now, I'm working on a book about a case about an organization called the Holy Land Foundation. The Holy Land Foundation was the largest Muslim charity in America, and they were closed down after 9/11, and the claim was that they were supporting, or they were providing material support to a terrorist organization, which the government claimed was Hamas. Now, how do you criminalize charity? How do you do it? Again, you have to have some sick mind sitting there planning and creating these things, these ideas. Well, here, I'll give you two examples. One is this. They had an orphan program where they were helping orphans, and they were sending small stipends of maybe $50 a month or so. And they're providing food, and they're providing school equipment and uniform for schools and so forth. Now, why were these kids orphans? So there was a list of these orphans, and a list of the fathers and the cause of death of the father. And in many of them, if not most, the cause of death that was listed was shaheed, martyr. Well, they said, martyr means suicide bomber, means if you're giving these people money, then you are supporting terrorism. You're encouraging. That's what George Bush said. They were encouraging young people to become suicide bombers. Now, the term shaheed does not mean suicide bomber. The term shaheed means martyr, and it's a term of respect for somebody who dies. Now, if somebody dies for a cause in battle and so forth, they're certainly called a martyr, but it's a name that is given to people who don't necessarily always die as a result of battle or that sort of thing. It's a term of respect for the dead. But that was it. Why ruin a good story with the facts? Now, besides that, out of close to 200 Palestinian suicide bombers who committed attacks, none had children. None of them had children. So they didn't leave any orphans. The suicide bombers didn't leave any orphans. That was not the profile of a suicide bomber. But again, why let the facts interfere with a good story? Martyr means suicide bombing, means giving them a stipend, giving them food, giving them equipment for school, and making sure they go to school is supporting terrorism, end of story. The other part is families of prisoners. Israel has been holding thousands of Palestinian prisoners in jail. Thousands. Now, according to Israeli sources, the vast majority of these prisoners have never been charged with acts of violence. The vast majority of these Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails have never been charged with acts of violence. So they're not terrorists. They're political prisoners. But that's not the story. That just disturbs the narrative. The story is, if Israel put them in jail, they must have a good reason. They must be terrorists. End of story. So if you're supporting their families, then you are supporting, or you are providing material support and encouraging people to become terrorists. That is the logic. Now, the Holy Land Foundation was closed down. 5 men who ran and operated the organization and received prison terms. I'll talk about that in a second. But they did it with World Mission, which is a Christian charity, large Christian charity. Just recently, they said that their guy in Gaza took $40 million and gave it to Hamas. There's no documentation, there's no proof, but that's what the Israelis said. End of story. And they do it on and on and on a regular basis. Now, I've been researching this case and getting it ready for a book for several years now, and I've spoken to several lawyers who worked on the case, and the lawyers describe it by saying the entire judicial system has been taken hostage here in the United States. I'm talking about the United States. The Constitution, laws, and government agency regulations have been suspended. These are the things that protect us, basically. And as a result of very, very heavy pressure by Israel and pro-Israeli groups, as a result of the post-9/11 hysteria, and the way these lawyers described it, the cowardice of the judiciary. Look at the prison sentences. They never killed a single person. They never hurt a single person. Never mind the fact they're providing aid to Palestinians. Look at the prison sentences. 65 years in high security federal prison for 2 of them. 20 years for one and 15 years for 2 of the others. The 3 with the pictures are just people, 3 that I was able to visit in prison. The other 2 I was not able to visit in prison. And again, one of the lawyers, the way one of the lawyers described it, he said, it is completely unheard of in the annals of the law, such a breach of justice, such an injustice that was done to these people. Well, the entire body of evidence proves they did nothing wrong. The state has a small folder with newspaper clippings and rumors, and judge after judge, appellate court after appellate court, jury after jury, convict, 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 and they have no say. So, rockets are no good. BDS we know is no good. Charity to Palestinians is no good. Palestinians are basically allowed to either be victims or to be terrorists. The idea that Palestinians have a right to resist, that resistance is legitimate when you're oppressed and you're under occupation, doesn't even cross people's minds when we talk about Palestine. Now there's a quote from Frantz Fanon, which I assume some of you probably read, about resistance and about colonialism. And Frantz Fanon wrote that colonialism is not a machine capable of thinking, it's not a body endowed with reason. Colonialism is naked violence and only gives in when confronted with greater violence. And this has been proven time and time again, sadly. In Algeria, the French probably would never have left if the Algerian resistance was not brutally violent. In southern Lebanon, Israel would never have left if Hezbollah weren't brutally violent against the Israeli military. But what we do know today is that armed resistance is not the only form, and certainly not necessarily the most effective form of resistance. What we know today largely is a result of the experience in India, their experience here in Black America, the South African experience, and for the last several decades, the Palestinian experience. We know that there are other ways, unarmed resistance, methods of unarmed resistance that are effective in combating and defeating colonialism and injustice. And if we want to talk about what defining Israel is colonial and injustice and racism that were brought to Palestine from Europe. That is what defines Israel. So what do we have? We know that economic pressure works. We know that political isolation works. We've all seen it. I think most of us have been alive when apartheid fell. It looks like most of us in the room have been alive. We're alive then, when apartheid fell in South Africa. And boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS. It's principled. It works. It's nonviolent. It's dedicated. It has a track record. It has a history. You can't kill it. And the call for BDS, the call to boycott, divest, and impose sanctions on Israel came to us from Palestinian civil society. The largest coalition of individuals and organizations in Palestine put out the call for the world to do the right thing by imposing BDS, just like was done in South Africa. And when I talk to people in South Africa, everybody said BDS brought down apartheid. Now it's our turn to help, so we're supporting BDS to help the Palestinians. And of course we know the governor here in New York signed an executive order making it illegal to talk about or to call for and so forth against BDS. It's absurd. Never mind a violation of the First Amendment. Never mind that it's okay to boycott the Russians and the Iranians and the Germans and God knows who else. But we just cannot boycott Israel. How does anybody even explain this? And I know that this governor and the governor of California and every other governor and every other state legislature that passed these crazy laws making it illegal or criminalizing BDS are all going to go down on their knees and apologize one day. They are all going to regret it. When Palestine is free, all of these cowards, spineless politicians are going to go down on their knees and say we were wrong. Or they might hide in the corner and pretend it never happened. That happens too. Everybody that called Nelson Mandela a terrorist, after 1994 there was this general amnesia. Nobody remembered that he was a terrorist. Everybody went up to, they went on pilgrimages to see Nelson Mandela. The same with Martin Luther King and many others. They somehow forget. This, nobody will forget, because we know exactly who signed these executive orders. We know exactly the governors who signed off on this legislation. And it's criminal, and it's stupid, and it's the wrong thing to do. And they will remember it as having stood on the wrong side of this very moral issue, this very important issue. So I encourage everybody. Plus, it's a stupid law because I don't know any activist that wouldn't be glad to be arrested for violating these laws. Right? So, there's Ariel in the back. Very happy to be arrested. By the way, here in the United States, there's another aspect of the resistance. People call it solidarity. I don't believe it's solidarity. I believe it's resistance. And that is Students for Justice in Palestine on campuses. The groups, Students for Justice in Palestine, for Justice in Palestine on campuses over the last 7-8 years have completely changed the way we talk about Palestine. I don't know if you guys remember, some of us are old enough to remember when Jimmy Carter wrote his book, Peace Not Apartheid. He could not set foot on a university campus. Today you have people talking like I do, completely not accepting or rejecting Israeli legitimacy. And, the list of colleges that I and many others, we would not have been at this point today had it not been for these young, courageous, hardworking students on campuses really putting up with a lot of difficulties in order to get this done. So SJP, I believe, is a strong and a very important part of this resistance. Now, as we sit here today, all of us, rich, free, and alive, all at the same time, as they say, we share a grave responsibility. Besides the fact that we all pay taxes and our tax money is going to support this terrible reality in Palestine, we have to look for hope. We have to identify where hope lies, and then we have to act to help it materialize. We cannot say it's hopeless. We cannot say there's nothing we can do. We cannot say it's too complicated. We do not have that luxury. We do not have the luxury to look at Palestine, to look at what happened there, largely as a result of American money, and say, well, it's too complicated, we can't do anything. We do not have that luxury. We have to define it, and then we have to act. And really, it boils down to two choices. It's really quite simple. The first option is occupied Palestine, as it is today, with exclusive rights for Jewish people, which is what the state of Israel is. It's occupied Palestine. They call it a Jewish state, mostly because it offers exclusive rights to Jews. But we have to understand that any sort of support for Israel comes at a cost. It's a package deal. Like Omar Barghouti said, that the existence of a Jewish state anywhere, in any part of Palestine, cannot but infringe upon the rights of Palestinians. He said it better than me, but that's what he said. And he's right. The existence of a Jewish state in Palestine cannot but infringe on the rights of Palestinians, the indigenous people. It comes with political prisoners. It comes with bombing Gaza. It comes with racist laws. It comes with denying people water. And it comes with children who die out of curable diseases only because they were born Palestinians in Gaza. That's the price. And it's a question of values. If anybody accepts this and this sits well with their values, then there's nothing we can do. That's not about politics. But there is another option. And that other option is a free democratic Palestine. That other option is a Palestine that allows for the right of return of the refugees, repatriation of the refugees, and compensation for equal rights. It's a free democratic state that respects human rights and civil rights and affords justice and freedom to everybody who lives in Palestine. Now, these are the options, and it's up to us to choose which one of these two offers hope. Which one of these two offers hope? It's very simple. These are the two options. And I, for one, believe that the second option is the one that provides hope. And I believe that all of us, again, who are rich, free, and alive, and have a conscience, need to line up behind the banner of creating this democratic Palestine and fight for it and do everything we can in order to see it happen. That is what I believe. Now, I'm going to leave you with this picture. And this is a picture that I took at a refugee camp, in a refugee camp, a Palestinian refugee camp. And I promise you that if any of us had to live there, had to visit there, none of us would be smiling. I was visiting there with friends, and I can tell you after 5 minutes, there was not a single dry eye among us. The conditions, the poverty are beyond belief. Beyond belief. And this is maybe 20 minutes, half an hour away by car from the very country, from the very land, from the very towns and villages from which their grandparents were kicked out. And the only reason they live like this is because Israel won't allow them to return home. And the only reason Israel can do it is because America is giving it so much money. This is a reality that is inexcusable, it's unjustifiable, and must be changed. And just as a final thought, what does it mean when we say a free Palestine? Unless we have it absolutely clear in our minds, what does a free Palestine mean, we will never be able to achieve it. We won't know what we're fighting for. A free Palestine means from the river to the sea. A free Palestine means from the Galilee in the north to the Negev Desert in the south. The free Palestine means no checkpoints and no racist laws. It means the end of the military occupation. It means free travel for anybody. It means the right of return. That is what a free Palestine is. It's a Palestine where everyone who lives within those boundaries is free and equal, has equal opportunities and so forth under the law. That is what a free Palestine is. And that is what we must strive for. And that is what we must fight for. And I will tell you this in closing, that I absolutely believe that a free Palestine must become a reality. It can become a reality, and it's up to us to make it a reality. Thank you very much.